Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving straight into something, well, something we all think we understand, but is actually incredibly complex.
Yeah.
The science behind sex differences in the brain.
Yeah, it's a conversation that it really stretches back centuries, doesn't it? You see these ideas about inherent differences, men and women, really shaping how societies were set up.
Right.
I mean, think about Aristotle, for instance. He created this whole binary, women were associated with the dark and curved, men with the good and straight.
Wow. And that kind of thinking, it's had very real effects throughout history, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Very tangible effects.
These perceived differences, they've been used to justify some pretty significant inequalities. I mean, in the U.S., women couldn't even vote until 1920.
Right.
And it wasn't until, 1974 that federal law allowed them to open a bank account in their own name without a male cosigner.
Exactly, 1974. So yeah, this isn't just some abstract academic discussion. It has real-world roots and consequences.
Definitely. So our goal today is to really dig into the scientific research.
Yeah, we'll be looking at actual scientific articles, research papers, trying to understand what the data really tells us about brain-sex differences.
We want to get a solid grasp on the current scientific understanding, without getting totally lost in all the complicated stats and jargon.
Exactly. We're sifting through studies on, brain networks, how different parts connect.
And neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change.
And the neuroscience of these sex differences. We're looking for those aha moments.
Yeah, those surprising insights that can help us move beyond maybe some simple, often outdated ideas. Okay, so let's unpack this.
Where to start?
What did the initial scientific explorations tell us? How did this whole field of study really get going?
Well, the modern era, you could say, really kicked off with MRI technology, magnetic resonance imaging. That was in the 1980s.
Like MRI.
And as one of our sources points out, the number of studies using MRI to look at human brain sex differences it exploded from that point on.
So suddenly we had this incredible tool, didn't we? To see inside the living brain in detail like never before.
Precisely.
So what were some of the first maybe big discoveries or claims that came out using this new tech?
Well, one of the early ones, and it was pretty influential for a while, was the idea that women had a larger corpus callosum.
The corpus callosum. That's the big bundle of nerve fibers connecting the left and right halves of the brain, right?
That's the one, yeah. And this was based on some of the initial studies, often looking at brains after death, actually.
That sounds like a pretty fundamental difference. But you said claim.
Yeah.
So what happened? Did it hold up as more research came in?
Well, as researchers started looking at larger groups of people, especially using MRI on living brains, the picture got much more nuanced.
Yep.
It turned out that while those early findings suggested a difference, researchers realized you have to account for the fact that men, on average, tend to have slightly larger brains overall.
Right, about 11% larger, I think.
Something like that, yeah. And when they controlled for that overall brain size difference, this apparent difference in the corpus callosum, it largely disappeared.
I see.
There's a big study in 2021, a meta-analysis led by Elliott, that really emphasized this. They found the male-female categories only accounted for 1% of the variation in corpus callosum size across the biggest MRI studies.
Only 1%. So that initial kind of headline-grabbing idea started to look a lot less solid as more data poured in.
Pretty much, yeah.
But the research didn't just stop there, did it? We started seeing more sophisticated tools being used, like machine learning.
Exactly. That's been a big thing over the last decade or so, using machine learning algorithms to analyze these huge data sets from brain scans.
Okay.
The goal is to see if computers can find subtle patterns across many different brain features that could reliably tell the difference between groups of male and female brains.
And these studies, they often report pretty impressive results, right? Like sex prediction accuracy, sometimes over 85%, even 90%.
They do, yeah. You see those high numbers reported quite often.
That sounds like pretty strong evidence for, distinctly male and female brain types. But here's where it gets really interesting, I think.
Go on.
Does that high accuracy automatically mean our brains are fundamentally different in a binary two types kind of way?
Well, not necessarily. And this is a really crucial point. While that high prediction accuracy might sound super convincing,
Yeah.
we need to be really careful about how we interpret it. Think about it. Even if an algorithm is 90% accurate,
Okay.
that still means 10% of people in a large group are being misclassified. 1 in 10.
That's a significant number when you put it like that.
Right. It suggests we're not dealing with two completely separate, distinct categories. The ability to predict sex from a scan, while it's statistically significant in these studies, it doesn't automatically mean brains are fundamentally different in a way that perfectly maps onto just male or female.
So it's not dimorphism, like two completely different forms.
Exactly. As one source points out, it's not the kind of accuracy you'd need for, say, a medical diagnosis. And frankly, there are much, much simpler ways to determine someone's sex than putting them in an MRI machine.
Good point. So the idea of a clear hardwired difference is actually being challenged by the very data that initially seemed like it might support it.
Yes, in a way. Which brings us neatly to the counterarguments and the more complex picture that's starting to emerge now.
Okay, let's get into that complexity.
Precisely. So while some studies, like one in 2021 led by Williams, did find some regional brain volume differences even after accounting for height and weight.
So contradicting the idea that all differences disappear with those controls.
Kind of, yeah. It added another layer. But the overall picture is still pretty complex. Then you have a 2022 meta-analysis by Debunking, which tried to synthesize a lot of these findings, and they concluded that there are probably, quote, small to moderate effect size differences in specific brain regions that aren't just about overall size.
Small to moderate. Okay. That definitely suggests it's not a stark black and white situation.
Yeah.
More shades of gray.
Exactly. And I remember reading something interesting in our the Reddit discussion we looked at about the idea of a continuum.
Yes. Tell me about that.
Well, it was a really insightful point someone made. The idea was basically if brain differences were purely down to cultural influences, just how we're raised, we might actually expect to see a much smoother range, a real continuum of characteristics across individuals. You know, some men showing traits more common in women, some women showing traits more common in men, just because of different levels of exposure to gender roles.
That makes a lot of sense. If it was all just socialization, you'd expect way more overlap and blurring, maybe.
Right. And this kind of thinking leads us towards the concept of the human brain mosaic.
The brain mosaic.
Yeah. It's this idea that individual brains aren't neatly filed into either a male box or a female box. Instead, each person's brain is a unique mix and match, a mosaic of features. Some of those features might be statistically more common in males, others more common in females.
Okay, so instead of two distinct types of brains, we have this vast landscape of individual brains, each with its own unique pattern, its own mosaic of characteristics.
That's the idea. Lots of individual variation within these broad statistical trends.
Okay, so let's zoom in then. If it's about these individual features, what do we know about specific brain structures? Like, the amygdala.
Right, the amygdala, often linked to emotions, threat detection. It's been studied quite a bit in this context.
Yeah.
Well, a review in 2017 found that, yes, if you just look at the raw size, men tend to have a slightly larger amygdala, on average maybe 10% larger.
Okay.
But, and here's the recurring theme, this difference mostly vanishes when you adjust for overall brain size.
Okay. So size itself isn't the main story there either? What about how active it is?
Interestingly, studies haven't found really consistent differences in how active the amygdala is between sexes, on average. But there might still be subtle differences in its fine structure, or maybe how it's wired up, or how it functions chemically, that could contribute to some observed behavioral differences.
Like what?
For example, a 2012 review mentioned findings suggesting men, on average, tend to show stronger physiological reactions to threats and, statistically, engage in more physical aggression. Now, linking that directly and solely to the amygdala is tricky, but it's part of the puzzle.
Okay, so potential functional nuances, even if the size difference isn't significant after correction. What about the hippocampus? That's crucial for memory, right?
Yeah, hippocampus and memory, learning. Very important. And the story there is, well, pretty similar, actually.
Let me guess. Initial findings suggested a difference, but then...
You got it. Initial studies, including a 2016 meta-analysis, did point towards a larger hippocampus in men, on average. But again, once researchers adjusted for overall brain size, that difference didn't really hold up consistently. But there are other interesting angles. One hypothesis tries to link potential subtle sex-based brain differences, maybe in how certain networks operate, to observations about mental health.
How so?
Specifically, there's a theory suggesting that maybe a network called the salience network, which helps us notice and focus on important things, might be, on average, slightly more reactive or prone to overactivity in women.
Okay, the salience network.
And the idea is that this potential difference might contribute to why women, statistically, have higher rates of certain stress-related disorders like PTSD or major depression. If that network is constantly flagging things as highly important or threatening,
It could potentially lead to a heightened stress response. That's an interesting, though still hypothetical, connection.
exactly. It's about how these structures function within wider brain networks, not just their size in isolation.
Right, so it's less about individual parts being bigger or smaller, maybe more about the connections and the communication. What about that old idea of left brain versus right brain thinking? Does that differ between sexes?
Lateralization. The idea that certain functions are more dominant in one hemisphere. Language is the classic example.
Yeah.
Some early research, like a study back in 1995 looking at language processing, did suggest there might be sex differences in how language is organized across the hemispheres.
Okay, what did it suggest?
The idea was maybe language was more bilaterally represented, using both sides more equally, in women compared to men.
But I sense a but coming.
Well, yeah. More recent reviews and larger studies suggest a much more complex and, frankly, less clear-cut picture. The evidence for really consistent, strong sex differences in language lateralization isn't definitive.
So another initial finding that became more complicated.
Pretty much. There's some speculation that maybe tiny differences in how quickly signals travel between the two hemispheres could play a role in functional specialization, but it's still debated.
Okay. So these brain structures, these networks, they obviously don't exist in a vacuum. What role do hormones play in all of this? That seems crucial.
Oh, hugely important. Hormones, especially the gonadal or sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen, have a really significant impact, both during development, setting things up, and also throughout life, sort of maintaining the brain's internal balance or homeostasis.
Right.
You find receptors for these hormones scattered throughout the brain. Estrogen receptors, for example, are found in key areas like the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the hippocampus we just talked about, and the frontal cortex.
Which tells us estrogen must have a pretty broad influence on brain function.
Absolutely.
And we often think of estrogen primarily in the female brain context, though men have it too, of course. What are some of its specific effects on, say, how we think?
Well, estradiol, which is a main type of estrogen, has definitely been shown to affect cognitive functions, things like learning and memory.
In what way?
Interestingly, it seems to be dose sensitive. The effect depends on the amount. Some research suggests that very high levels of estrogen might actually impair performance on certain learning and memory tasks.
Oh, really? So more isn't always better?
Apparently not in all cases, yeah. It can sometimes lead to poorer performance compared to males when estrogen levels are very high. Also, thinking about fluctuations, the changes and the overall drop in estrogen during menopause, that can definitely influence mood and motivation. The thinking is it might partly be due to effects on how certain brain chemicals called opioid peptides are working.
That provides some biological insight into experiences associated with menopause.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay, what about testosterone?
So testosterone is considered an androgen, a hormone linked to male characteristics. It has what are called organizational effects on the developing brain, sort of sculpting it early on.
Masculinizing effects, is that the term?
That's often the term used, yes. But what's really fascinating is that many of these masculinizing effects of testosterone on the brain are actually carried out after testosterone gets converted into estrogen within the brain itself.
Wait, testosterone gets converted to estrogen in the brain.
Yes. There's an enzyme in the brain called aromatase that does exactly that. So estrogen, derived from testosterone, plays a key role in masculinizing certain brain circuits during development.
Wow. Okay, so it's definitely not as simple as estrogen for females, testosterone for males. The interaction is way more intricate.
Much more intricate. And progesterone plays roles, too, in both sexes.
Now, even if there are some initial biological differences influenced by hormones or genetics, the brain isn't set in stone, right? It's not static.
Absolutely not. And that brings us to the crucial concept of neuroplasticity.
The brain's ability to change.
Exactly. It's the brain's amazing capacity to reorganize itself, to form new connections between neurons, basically throughout our entire lives.
Like building new pathways.
Yeah, think of it like a muscle getting stronger with exercise, or maybe paths in a forest becoming clearer and wider the more you use them. The brain physically changes based on experience.
So even if there are some average starting differences in brain structure between sexes, the brain is constantly being shaped and reshaped by everything we do, everything we learn.
And even through specific therapies, it's incredibly dynamic.
And aren't we even learning more about the possibility that the brain might keep creating new brain cells, new neurons, even in adulthood?
Adult neurogenesis.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a really hot area of research. It's been clearly shown to happen in other animals, like rodents.
But in humans?
The evidence for significant, widespread creation of new neurons in adult human brains is, well, less conclusive and still debated. Some areas, maybe the hippocampus, might retain some capacity, but it's not as clear as in other species.
Okay, so maybe not floods of new neurons, but the broader idea of plasticity changing connections, strengthening pathways that's solid.
Oh, absolutely solid. Very well established, and have huge implications for recovery from injury, for learning, and as you mentioned, for therapy.
Right, therapy. How does this ability of the brain to change actually get used in treatments?
Well, there are some great examples where therapies explicitly leverage neuroplasticity. Mirror therapy for phantom limb pain is one.
How does that work?
People look into a mirror position so it reflects their intact limb, making it look like their missing limb is still there and moving when they move the intact one.
Okay.
And this visual feedback, this illusion, can actually change the brain. It's been shown to alter connectivity in a brain network called the frontoparietal network, and it can reduce the phantom pain.
Wow, so tricking the brain visually actually rewires it.
In a sense, yes. Another example is constraint-induced movement therapy, or CIMT. This is often used for stroke patients.
What does that involve?
They restrain the patient's unaffected arm or limb, forcing them to use the limb that was weakened by the stroke much more intensively.
Kind of forcing the brain to pay attention to that limb again.
Exactly. And studies show that CIMT leads to increased activity in the motor and sensory areas of the cortex related to that affected limb. It helps drive recovery of function by promoting neuroplastic changes.
So these are really clear demonstrations of the brain actively reshaping itself in response to targeted experience or intervention.
Definitely.
This whole idea of a dynamic, changeable brain is so important when we circle back to that big ongoing debate. Nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
To what extent are the differences we sometimes observe between men and women, biological, maybe hardwired, versus shaped by society, culture, upbringing?
It's a million-dollar question, isn't it? And you see different perspectives in our sources. For instance, we looked at an article arguing that new brain research confirms that gender differences are hardwired.
Right. And that type of article often uses anecdotes, like the family doctor observing differences in language development or attention spans in young boys and girls.
Exactly. Those kinds of personal stories and observations often resonate with people's own experiences, making the hardwired argument feel quite intuitive or relatable for many.
Sure, you hear those things. But then we also have strong counter-arguments, like in the Reddit discussion and other scientific articles we read.
Yes. And a key point raised there is that just because we find a difference in brain scans, a neural correlate, that doesn't automatically tell us its cause. It doesn't automatically mean it's genetic or purely biological.
It could be the result of experience, couldn't
And it absolutely could. The Reddit discussion brought up the really insightful point that environmental influences go way beyond just obvious culture.
Like what?
Like the different names we're given, or maybe even the subtly different visual perspectives we might have just because of average height differences between sexes. These seemingly small, non-cultural environmental factors could also shape brain development and function.
That's a fascinating point, things we don't even think about.
Right. And furthermore, there's a critique of the whole research practice of just sorting people into binary male-female boxes for comparison.
Why is that criticized?
Well, some argue it's overly simplistic. It ignores the spectrum of gender identity and experience. Maybe, for some questions, it would be more informative to look at things like someone's individual experience or expression of their gender role, rather than just their assigned sex at birth. Some research on aggression tries to do this, for example.
Looking at psychological gender rather than just biological sex.
Something along those lines, yeah.
Yeah.
Considering a more nuanced variable.
And we have to remember the historical context here, too, as even that hardwired differences article touches on.
What?
Claims of inherent difference have a long, troubling history of being used to justify discrimination.
Precisely. That's why researchers and commentators urge so much caution. We need to be incredibly careful about interpreting findings in ways that could reinforce harmful stereotypes or legitimize inequalities.
So where does that leave the overall scientific understanding right now?
Well, the general consensus reflected in many of our sources seems to be that while some average brain differences between groups of men and women can be measured, these differences tend to be small. They're not always consistently found across different studies and populations. They're often related to that overall brain size difference we talked about.
Right.
And crucially, the extent to which these small average brain differences directly cause behavioral differences, independent of all the complex social and cultural factors, that's still very much an open question and actively debated.
So not a simple picture at all. Some researchers even argue for a more, what was the term, sexually monomorphic view.
Yeah, basically arguing that male and female brains are overall much more similar than they are different, that the variations within each sex are actually much larger than the average difference between the sexes for most brain features.
This really underscores the ongoing challenges and, frankly, the debates happening within the scientific community itself about how to study this properly.
Oh, absolutely. The article, Tempests and Tales, Challenges to the Study of Sex Differences in the Brain, really highlights this internal discussion and scrutiny.
What are the main concerns?
Well, there are concerns about methodological rigor, the potential for bias in interpretation, oversimplification of complex findings, and how results get communicated and sometimes misinterpreted when they reach the general public.
Yeah, the headline effect again.
Exactly. But at the same time, many researchers strongly argue that it is important to consider sex and gender as critical biological variables in research.
Why?
Because ignoring potential sex differences could lead to overlooking important aspects of biology or medicine. As that Tempests and Tales article points out, sometimes comparing male and female physiology or brains has actually led to discovering entirely new biological mechanisms or functions that were previously unknown.
So it's not about stopping the study of sex differences,
Not at all.
but about doing it better, with more careful methods, more sophisticated analysis, and a really critical awareness of the potential pitfalls and the social context.
Precisely. There's a clear call mentioned in sources like Precision Medicine and the failed search for binary brain sex differences and sex contextualism in laboratory research for what's termed sex-inclusive biomedicine, meaning research designs and analytical methods that are more sophisticated than just simple male versus female comparisons.
Yeah.
Methods that account for complexity, context, and individual variation.
Okay, wow, we've really gone deep here today. Let's try to bring it all together for our listeners. What are the main things you hope people take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important takeaway is really the complexity and the nuance. That's the key. While we do observe some average differences in brain structure and function between large groups of men and women, the idea of a simple binary split between a male brain and a female brain just isn't supported by the current scientific evidence.
Right. Many reported differences are small, often related to overall brain size.
And how much these differences, independent of all the social and cultural learning we do, actually drive behavior? Well, that's still a really big question mark. Lots of ongoing research there.
So you, our listener, hopefully feel much better informed now. You've got a much deeper understanding of the actual scientific conversation happening around brain sex differences, letting you move way beyond those catchy, but ultimately too simple headlines.
And that brings us maybe to a final thought for you to mull over. Given everything we've discussed, especially the brain's incredible ability to change and adapt its neuroplasticity, and given this ongoing, evolving scientific discussion, how might our understanding of sex differences continue to shift in the future? What are the implications of this more complex, nuanced, plastic view for how we see ourselves, how we see others?
Thinking about that intricate dance between biology, environment, experience, and just sheer individual variation.
Exactly. How do all those factors play together?
Some really fascinating questions to ponder. And for those of you who want to explore the technical side even further, we've included links in our show notes to resources about how scientists actually analyze brain networks and the tools they use for things like functional connectivity and network visualization.
Yeah, some cool stuff there if you want to geek out a bit more.
Definitely. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.